All right, so one of the main reasons why Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema were successfully able to completely gut Joe Biden's Build Back Better plan is because the mainstream media throughout this entire negotiation process has basically outright refused to talk about the actual substance in this bill or address the blatant and brazen out in the open corruption of both Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin. And so David Sirota, who has a publication that I'm sure most of you guys are already aware of called The Daily Poster, where he does absolutely fantastic journalism, and I recommend you guys go and check them out. But he basically went on Brian Stelter's CNN show where he was giving an honest critique of how the media has been covering this entire negotiation process. And I think he did a really good job here. It's really rare that we get somebody like David Sirota on one of the mainstream networks, let alone to specifically critique how they have been going about their coverage. So this is a pretty unique opportunity. And let's just go ahead and see how Brian took this criticism.
It's a big week for President Biden, a really big week, the biggest week yet. It feels like we hear a version of that every single week. Maybe we should try to analyze it or scrutinize that framing a little bit. Here to do that and much more, David Sirota. He's the founder of the Daily Poster. He's also out with a really interesting new podcast called Meltdown that we'll talk about in a minute. David, good to see you.
Good to see you.
You were writing speeches for Bernie Sanders in 2020, so we know what side of the aisle you're on or what side of the Democratic fight you're on. I would love to hear your number one critique of how Biden and his social safety net bill and how this battle to get it through Congress, how it's being covered in the press. Your number one critique.
My number one critique is that there hasn't been a lot of following of the money. That if you pay attention to the conversation in the media, there hasn't been a lot of context about which industries are buying which politicians. You see the parties fighting with each other, you see the pieces of the Democratic coalition fighting with each other, but removed from much of the story is the fact that the oil industry, the fossil fuel industry is pumping a lot of money into this. The pharmaceutical industry is pumping a lot of money into this. Many of the members of Congress who are trying to kill Democrats' promised prescription drug plan, they have taken a huge amount of money from the pharmaceutical industry. So writing the money behind the bill out of the story of the bill is a huge problem, and it doesn't give viewers and readers the context that they need.
This relates to your new series, Meltdown, which you and Alex Gibney have done. I think it's important because it gives historical context to the last 12 years. You go back to the financial crisis and you say, a lot of what's happened since Trump's election, what's happened, it all is because of the financial meltdown 2008 and 2009. So how can we infuse more historical context into today's news coverage?
Well, look, I think when you take the reconciliation bill and then that's in Congress right now, there's this baked-in idea that the Democrats have to basically pare back their promised agenda in order to try to win the midterm elections. But of course, if you go back to the 2009-2010 era, which we do in our podcast Meltdown, you take a look at the Democrats doing the same thing. At that point, it was on behalf of their Wall Street donors. They pared back help for regular people. They did a huge bailout for big bankers who had created the problem unto itself. And there was a huge backlash. The Democrats ended up getting shellacked. Those were the words of Barack Obama. They got shellacked in the elections in part because there was a lot of disillusionment from voters who said, look, we were promised help. We didn't get help. So if you fast forward to today, a lot of the media coverage presumes that if Democrats need to pare back their agenda in order to appease so-called moderate voters. But in fact, the historical context says the exact opposite.
So we have to infuse what we know from history into the daily coverage. And what we need is a little bit less of the kind of the hysterical minute by minute and a little bit more of the broader story here. Where can we find Meltdown, by the way?
It's on Audible right now.
There we go. Thanks for coming on the program. Good.
All right, so first of all, my impression from just this segment alone on Brian Stelter, this guy seems like a complete fucking idiot, all right? He seemed like he was barely able to even keep up with the very basic shit that David Sirota was rightfully pointing out there, and then basically just concluded it by saying, yes, we really need to have some sort of a historical analysis or an awareness of previous events that have happened throughout history that may have some sort of a reflection or a pertinence to the current moment that we are in. That was nuts that it seemed like it was that difficult for Brian to be able to figure out that basic reality. But yeah, I mean, David is 100% correct. The parallels between the 2008 financial crisis in terms of like not necessarily how the crises inevitably came about, because obviously that was a financial crisis caused by massive bankers who were engaging in basically criminal activity. But now we have the pandemic that is on top of the economic crises. It's two relatively different situations, but the overlap politically, especially as he was just pointing out there, is absolutely massive, because you had Barack Obama, who was taking power right as this crisis was hitting an inflection point, basically, and he takes power. He has essentially a supermajority with Democrats controlling the Senate and Congress and the House, and he does it to basically bail out gigantic banking institutions that screwed over the American people while not providing adequate material relief for the people who had been taken advantage of or taken advantage by these gigantic banking institutions, and they completely failed to actually address the crisis as it was for average Americans, and that led to them, as he just described, as Obama previously said, getting absolutely shellacked. And that's exactly what they're on track to do right now in response to the current pandemic and the subsequent economic crisis. Joe Biden's entire agenda has just been completely eviscerated by less than a handful of corporate ghouls who are doing absolutely nothing but representing their donors. And that was the other point that David was trying to get Brian to understand here, is this entire conversation in the mainstream media has just been focused around, okay, you have these so-called moderates or centrists versus progressives, when the actual reality is, if you look at what the American people want, progressives are the moderates in this conversation. Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema, the other corporate Democrats, they are far-right extremists relative to what the American people are supporting in this agenda, in these policies, basically. And so that's the reframing that David is trying to get him to understand and actually talk about the details behind their corruption. Because guess what? And I know I've talked about it a million times on this channel before, but the corruption is not hard to see, okay? You see here again, Kyrsten Sinema took $750,000 from Big Pharma, and then what do you know? She turns around, and even though she ran on drug pricing reform in 2018, she turns around and now suddenly she opposes it. It's almost like there is a direct correlation between the types of corporate backers that these corrupt politicians have and the legislative agenda that they are willing to support or oppose. They are simply taking their marching orders from these gigantic big pharma companies. In the case of Kyrsten Sinema, or in the case of Joe Manchin, it's the fossil fuel industry overwhelmingly. And obviously there's going to be crossover there between both of them. But Joe Manchin got big donations from son-in-law's oil and gas employer as he stripped major climate programs from this bill. Senator Joe Manchin received large donations from Enterprise Products, the energy giant where his son-in-law is a senior employee and whose lobbying groups are fighting the reconciliation bill. So again, this is criminal behavior, or should be criminal behavior, under any functioning democracy or a political system that isn't just completely baked and swamped in corruption, okay? This is surface level shit. It's not hard to see. You don't need to be going back and doing like these deep dives into their financial records and all of this. It's pretty out in the open who they are actually representing, and it's not the overwhelming majority of the American people. So that is the basic reframing that we should be expecting from a media that was actually trying to adequately inform the American people on what's going on right now. But unfortunately, we don't have that. We have corporate media that doesn't really give a shit about talking about the substance. They would rather just do exactly what Brian was saying at the end of that clip that they need less of. They simply cover the day-to-days. They cover whatever Trump happened to tweet, or now that he's not on Twitter, whatever statement Trump happened to put out, or they talk about all of these culture war nonsense issues instead of just talking about the actual policies that are on the table right now in terms of getting passed or not getting passed. But the corruption angle is also massively important that they basically never touch on. And the other important point here that he brought up was the 2008 financial crash. Yes, that still has a massive impact on how Americans are viewing the current politics of today. A decade, and this is an article from 2017, but it's still true today. A decade after the Great Recession, 1 in 3 Americans still haven't recovered. Okay, so we have tens of millions of Americans who still haven't recovered from the last financial crash. We now have an even worse financial crash and associated public health crisis in the COVID pandemic, and Democrats are letting their entire agenda get completely eviscerated and gutted by a handful of members of their own party. So it's like pretty much an exact overlap in terms of how Obama handled the 2008 financial crash. Now Biden is making the exact same mistakes, even though he was literally in the Obama administration and saw exactly how that played out. So either they don't really care about losing in 2022, or they are so corrupted and blinded that they are willing to let their entire agenda be tanked by a handful of corporate Democrats. The reality is, if Biden actually supported these policies and wanted to win in 2022, he would be forcing them through. He would be applying pressure on Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, but he didn't. He basically just immediately fell in line with what they want. And not only is he not fighting for the bills, but Democrats and the media, because of how they've been covering this, basically, Americans don't even know what's in this bill, so they don't even know what they're losing out on necessarily. And you see here, Biden, Democrats failing to sell agenda to the American people. Roughly 7 in 10 Americans know little about the bills that Democrats are negotiating. So we have so many problems in terms of how the media has been covering this bill, in terms of how this entire discussion has been playing out, even amongst progressives and so-called moderates, okay? Nobody, not even Bernie Sanders, not even members of the squad, seem to be able to go out there and directly say Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema, they are entirely corrupted ghouls, okay? They're not moderates, they're not centrists, they're just corrupt. And if this was happening in any other country around the world, the U.S. empire would be deeming it extremely corrupt and might even overthrow their government depending on how they are economically oriented ideologically. And so this is the reality of how our political system works. You have gigantic corporations, whether it's big pharma, whether it's the fossil fuel industry, that dump millions of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars into politicians' campaigns, and that's all it takes. They are willing to sell you out for those donations. They are willing, in the case of Joe Manchin especially, they are willing to sell you out for their own personal financial interests, as he makes hundreds of thousands of dollars a year from his dirty West Virginia coal plant. This is the corruption that is just baked and understood by the mainstream media to be just a part of the political system, and they never talk about it. They never talk about it as if it is what it is, and that is rampant corruption that is tanking the agenda that is overwhelmingly supported by the American people. So credit to David Sirota for taking that opportunity to go and try to explain to somebody like Brian Stelter, who is apparently a journalist who covers politics on a regular basis and still doesn't really seem to understand that you should have a historical analysis in your coverage of these things. But yeah, credit to David Sirota. Go check out his work at the Daily Poster, because he is doing the actual journalism that guys like Brian Stelter on CNN are not doing.